Welcome to this February edition of Streaming Media Advanced Forum. I'm Tim Siglin, contributing editor with Streaming Media Magazine, and as of this month, the founding executive director of Help Me Stream. I'll come back around and talk a little bit about that later. But first, I want to introduce the usual suspects. To my right on the Google Hangout is Dom Robinson. Dom, tell us a bit about...
Hey guys, how you doing? Good to see you all again. We're back, another SMAF. How's the weather where you guys are?
Cold and no snow, but supposedly going to get some snow tonight.
Good.
And then Eric, what's your title these days? Since
I am VP and editor-in-chief of Streaming Media.
Very good. So Dom, tell me what are you up to these days? There was some announcement I think that you made last week on LinkedIn. Fill us in a little bit on that.
So do you mean with my day job hat on, or do you mean with all the tinkering I've been doing on with the day job hat on? Oh, so
we day job first, and we'll come back to the tinkering later.
Okay, so with the day job, ideas is very busy at the moment with a lot of work with Perform. We seem to be allowed to talk about that a little bit. We've actually been doing some stuff with them for quite a while, but we've been building some interesting low latency remote commentary systems which allow people around the world to use a web page to watch a live sporting event and add foreign language commentary into the feed remotely through a low latency sort of WebRTC link into a browser, so basically from anywhere, and then we get that back in and muxed into the HD mezzanine stream back at the broadcasting facility without adding any latency to the delivery of the HD stream. So basically we complete the loop out to the commentary and back in, essentially trying not to add any latency at all to the compression, to the time it takes anyway, because of the compression of the high quality mezzanine that they're using around their facility. So that's been a really interesting project, and the Perform guys are getting us to do lots of other things as well. So and they're an interesting company. They do 45,000 live sporting events a year. And it's all at I was talking to someone last night, it's all at a sort of a tier B level, so it's kind of hockey leagues and tennis leagues and stuff that generally people historically have been betting on with those guys, but they are in the process of portalizing it. I think they've been up to stuff with I think it was one of the football leagues in the States under their DAZN brand. So yeah, they're good client. Big shout to them, because they've given us a couple of really big compliments in the last week, which was unprompted and very nice. So always good to have happy clients.
And you're not re-encoding anything. You're actually just inserting into the stream.
So we send them out the clean feed so that the commentators can hear the audience reactions and so on, and a low res video which they commentate against in the web page, and then we take the audio as high quality and lower latency as we can back, and mux that into the stream as the audio one of the audio channels in that.
So it's an alternate audio channel.
Exactly. So then that's then picked out by downstream systems, which we're starting to build, and other people have been putting in place for a long time with those guys, which then they can channel select depending on where they're syndicating the content out to.
Well, I may actually have a practical use for something like that we should talk about later. There's at the church that I go to, we're starting to stream, and we have somebody who does live Spanish translation. We're trying to figure out how to do that exact kind of thing. So awesome.
Yeah. Cool.
And Perform is primarily European based, or
well, they've got Toca. They're worldwide. They do sports all over the world, and they're absolute gorillas. Actually, when you look under the hoods, they've got a lot of. I think they're very strong in as much as they do the production themselves. They get the rights, they turn up, they make the stuff look good, and they produce the content, and they get it back to base, and then they syndicate it out. And they've historically done that a lot for betting. But now people are, there's a race on live. If last year was the year of live streaming, I think this is the year of live streaming rights, and I think they are actually gorillas in a low-hanging fruit space and a sort of tier B space. But maybe if Dan can sort his Wi-Fi out and get on air with us, then we can touch on some of the rights things. Talk of the devil, here he is. Dan, how are you?
Good. I'm having some technical issues though, so
that's okay. We're victims of it because we work with streaming technology.
So we'll actually come back to you in a couple of minutes here, Dan. We're going to move on to Eric on what he's doing, and then I'm going to talk briefly about what I'm doing, and then we'll pick up on Ben. All right, so Eric, bring us up to speed on what's going on with the streaming media world.
Yeah, well, it's funny Dom mentions Perform. and his company's been working with Perform. Perform is one of the companies that's going to be speaking at the Streaming Forum at the end of February in London. It's co-located with BVE. Alistair Kennedy is going to be speaking. Perhaps you've worked with him. He's the head of video architecture at Perform, Dom. And he's going to be speaking on a session about using the public cloud for live streaming, talking about what they're doing there. But the whole event is going to revolve around the notion of building smarter OTT services. We're going to talk a little bit, actually a fair amount, about AI and machine learning. Jeff Webb, who is the principal streaming architect at Sky, is going to be the keynoter, so he'll be kicking things off. And so we've got that coming up at the end of the month. And then within a few days, we'll be putting the program for Streaming Media East online. That'll be happening in New York in May. We've got 3 tracks we're running there, 3 main tracks: the business track, the tech track, the how-to track, and then we've got a one-day track devoted to AI and machine learning. And we've also got a track devoted entirely to video marketing and advertising that Troy Dreyer from onlinevideo.net will be running. We've got the Content Delivery Summit that Jason Tebow from the Streaming Video Alliance will be taking over this year. And we've got the Live Streaming Summit that Corey Benke from LiveX is running this year. So we've got a great mix of stuff we're working on there, and it'll be coming together, and the program should be going online soon.
Oh, very nice. So Streaming Forum comes up just before our next SMAF, the March SMAF. What kinds of things for a European audience can they expect there? I mean, you mentioned the Perform keynote, obviously, but are there other things that they should look at?
Well, I mean, it's almost entirely European-based companies or global companies, and we've got, as I said, we've got Perform speaking, we've got the European Football League speaking, we've got Google UK speaking, we've got the Football Association and BT Sport. So it certainly puts a European and UK spin on some of the topics that are familiar to people who attend streaming media shows and read streamingmedia.com regularly. But we do have a lot of folks talking about sports. We didn't set out to do that, but as we look at the impact of live streaming and where some of the discussion around rights is revolving today, sports is kind of leading the way. So that ended up being an unintended sort of theme that runs through the program.
And Dom, what was it that you said before Dan joined? If 2017 was the year of live streaming, 2018 is the year of live streaming rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's taken a long time for the industry to come to terms with the fact that you can do something approximating a television signal over that suddenly sort of sublimated last year, and now people are expecting to be able to watch live TV. And the conversation, I think the nuances in the technology are probably becoming less and less relevant to the larger conversation, which is all about what can you watch and the rights that can be procured and so on. I think we've got some good questions to throw it down in a little bit about how much the sector is in hype at the moment and how much it's actually got a clear picture of what's going on. But I certainly see a lot of activity in rights at the moment over the last few weeks.
Good. I'm going to hold off on talking about what I'm doing with Help Me Stream until later in the broadcast. I want to go to Dan since he's joined us now. So Dan, we've all worked with you for a number of years at Streaming Media Magazine, the streaming media shows. You're now out doing something else. Don't necessarily need to tell us what you're doing, but just give us a little brief update of what your take on the industry is here as we enter 2018.
Take on the industry? Well, it's pretty broad. I've always thought about the industry a little bit differently, which is you have to break the industry down into facets. Mm-hmm. Today more than ever, there's a huge group of professionals that rely on streaming media technology for their livelihood. And our industry for a long time has thought about streaming media as a product or a service when in fact it's not. It's technology. It's underlying technologies. When people say Netflix is a streaming company, no, Netflix is basically a content licensing and content creation company. They simply use streaming media technology to distribute that content. That's their vehicle.
Prior to that, they'd use DVD. You're right. So this is one step in the process as opposed to
there's an entire ecosystem there, obviously. So, the biggest thing that I'm seeing the need for every year, not just 2018, is just more educational resources, more good quality content that's educating users from a B2B standpoint of what's actually taking place. There's very little information shared. I mean, think about how long we've been talking about CPMs. Who out there actually shares what they pay for pre-roll, post-roll, and streamer and page ad? Nobody. So there's a huge amount of questions in the market that people have, and there's very little transparency. And that's always been one of the biggest issues in the industry. Now, you do have more companies being more forthright in terms of information that they're sharing. We are seeing more case studies in the market. But if you think about the vast majority of coverage we see around the industry, it's always around Netflix. It's always around Amazon. It's always around Disney. And yet you have amazing companies like Tesla, MasterCard, like not just enterprise companies, but, consumer brand companies. Like I'm doing some work with Adidas. They're doing some amazing stuff with video. So I just feel like the industry still just needs to evolve and educate more and make it very clear what the benefits are of the technology from an ROI standpoint, because there's still too many people running around talking about things like engagement or, this live stream allows someone to watch it for 20 minutes more. Yeah, but you're not saying how you monetize that. You're not saying if you made more money. You're not saying what the ad buys are. So there's still a huge problem on the monetization side.
So you did a really good job for a number of years of sort of pushing the CDN industry to tell, to reveal what it was, that the price per gigabyte for transport, storage, et cetera. Are you talking about essentially a similar model here where you asked people in the industry to provide you with information based off of what they were paying on CPMs, or are you asking the ad agencies or IAB or how do you?
Well, I mean, my job every day is to talk to companies who are using and adopting streaming media technologies in some way, shape, or form across the ecosystem. So, I didn't push the CDNs to release that information. They didn't want to. I went out to the customers who were using it, who saw the value of giving out that information, because if you collect it from a large enough sample size and they make it public, now everybody benefits. So it's just a matter of bringing transparency into an industry that has been very secretive to a degree for a long time. And there are certain elements of that you will never fix. But, when you do have more transparency in pricing and how products are sold, the biggest questions I always get asked is like, well, what does New Line really do? What does BAM really do? What does VDMS really do? Because they're all out there saying we offer an end-to-end ecosystem, but do they really do that? Are they doing ingestion? Do they have a teleport facility? Are they connected to a third party? Are they doing everything through waterfront communications? Are they doing their own transcoding? Everybody says they have an end-to-end ecosystem for monetization. Very few companies actually do. So customers then are very confused as to what companies actually do in-house versus what they partner with. So that lack of transparency by vendors in the market definitely hurts the growth of the use of video.
Interesting. So Dom, from a European standpoint, are things like CPM, is the industry more transparent there? And I think Dan sort of hit two things. He said CPMs, which is sort of to the classic ad model, which, there are aggregators who will buy ads and drive CPM cost negotiations, sort of like Ramp Rate did in the CDN space. But he's also bringing up the bigger point of sort of these end-to-end solutions where companies he mentioned, as well as companies like iStream and others, talk about having end-to-end solutions. How does the European market view that, or is advertising just not really that big a deal, big enough a deal from a monetization standpoint?
I think advertising's less welcome over here, because certainly in the UK, because we're a bit spoilt with the BBC output, and I think that's just a cultural thing. I think in terms of particular business models around advertising or whatever, I really get what Dan's saying. I think over here we have a less competitive market, so you get little clusters of types of business which are implementing models in certain ways, and they go off on one a bit into their own space. In some ways, because we've got more clusters like that, they tend to compete a little bit better, maybe, but perhaps not not in a way that necessarily interoperates well with the rest of the world. So I think the UK does its own thing. I think smaller countries often do. But what I find interesting, Dan, about what you're saying is I can picture a guy with a responsibility for broadly some video output under a brand name like Adidas, you mentioned, finding it very challenging to buy from the market, because I think that there are so many different ways. You know, you could sit down like we're doing here with virtually no overhead and produce a reasonable, engaging piece of content for a specific audience. If you're going to do something eye-catching and with production value and so on, you're into a totally different budget. I think the media industry as a whole, not just the streaming space, has it's sort of, to me, it sells packages anyway, specific bespoke packages, but that's the business I'm in. I think if you're trying to sell commodity, you've got to sell an apple and let people understand where an apple fits into the whole thing that they're trying to do. And I think I do think the streaming industry sells what looks like end-to-end solutions a lot, but actually it's very fragmented pieces of an entire picture, which somebody who's just doing some video output on the Adidas social media site or something, they don't really know how they get there, but they don't want to have a price variation of $5,000 from their mate's son and 250 grand from a production company around the corner and 5 million from the local TV company, you know. And I think there's too much. There's so many different ways to skin the cat. The market's so disrupted at the moment. I can really see that more price transparency would bring some value to that.
Yeah, it's more than price transparency, though. It's functionality, you know, more than anything else. You know, how do you compare the different CDNs or OVPs or live streaming linear platforms in the market? From a feature and functionality standpoint, a lot of them look very similar. So what is it that you're really buying from one to the other? That's what you have to figure out.
Yeah.
So it's part of it too is just setting the right expectations in the market. There's still far too many vendors who are out there setting false expectations on the size of these markets. I mean, how many more reports do we have to read saying just the CDN market alone is over $20 billion? If you take the top 7 CDNs, Akamai, Limelight, Level 3, Amazon, you add up all the revenue, it's $4 billion last year just for media. So where do you get 20 from? Well, when you really go back and you drill into these reports, it turns out that they're adding hardware, you know, and they're adding all these other third-party services. Well, CDNs don't sell hardware. So, you know, it's kind of like when Uala got bought by Telstra, and then they put out a blog post, the CEO saying the market was, I think he said $4.7 billion for the market they were in.
Yep, that is what he said.
Possible, considering Brightcove and Uala combined last year were just over $200 million. How's the market $4.5 billion? So, you know, then it's like, oh, well, we're including ad platforms and exchanges and networks. Well, you're not an ad platform, exchange, or network. You can't include that revenue. So expectations in this industry is crucial. Any industry, any market, anything that's volatile, it's about setting proper expectations. And this industry had a problem with that, obviously, in the dot-com days, but we still have a problem with it now. What's interesting is how the market is resetting expectations. Look at Brightcove stock price. Look at Yumi stock price. Look at companies that came into the market offering a lot and saying that they were going to dominate this market. And look at their stock prices today. Wall Street has gotten really, really smart and educated as to what's going on with vendors in our ecosystem that are public companies and private. And as a result, expectations get set differently. When when Amazon bought out Elemental for $296 million, you know, remember when that actually happened, TechCrunch put out a report saying that the deal size was $500 million.
Yeah.
Nobody checked that. So what happened was every other encoding, transcoding vendor in the market now set expectations for themselves of what they thought they were worth. Well, 6 months later, Amazon puts out the regulatory filing and they paid $206 million. Now every single transcoding company has to reset and reevaluate what its multiple is in terms of what it's worth in the market. So things like that are detrimental to the market. It truly impacts how much funding they get. It impacts what VCs and private equity guys want to do with these companies. Expectations is critical. It's everything in this industry, and yet it's not done very well.
It's interesting you say that, Dan, about the Telstra, Uyala, and the Amazon Elemental, because in doing the writing I'm doing for the 20th anniversary sourcebook, I'm indeed actually going through and looking at a number of the backstories on that. and valuations, even for Twitch, I mean, the valuation ranged widely in press reports. So Eric, make a note that 296 as opposed to 500 million, because I think I may have actually done the TechCrunch report as opposed to that. So I guess
can I just chip in, Dan? Did you see the one of the articles we flipped this week was that Caffeine's taken 46 million investment for a live broadcasting startup? Did you see that?
Yeah, I know those guys. It's interesting, but it's very early in the game for them. They have more than a proof of concept, which is good, but you know, there's a lot of money flowing to the market right now. You know, on the investment side, and all the guys that deal with on the Wall Street side, there's a lot of money in the market. A lot of them are looking at getting into this. At the same time, they're becoming much more educated in terms of what they should invest in and what they shouldn't. So you have right now maybe half a dozen or more deals that are currently being talked about and worked on the back end of companies we all know very well acquiring one another, merging with one another, because these companies can't stay standalone. So you're going to start to see in this industry even more consolidation, not where someone's being bought out for pennies on the dollar, but where two competitors come together to actually compete as one platform or one service in the market. And that's needed. You know, the 46 million they got, it's too early for me to judge that. But if you think about how many rounds some of these companies have gotten, you know, think of Conviva. Conviva took last year, was it their 6th or 7th round? You know, that's amazing that they were able to get that money, considering how long they've been around and considering they haven't sold to anybody or been acquired by anybody. So it shows that people are still excited in this market. It shows that there's still a lot of money. It's not hard to get investments in things. You know, I made my first private investment in a company last year that's tied to the streaming media and analytics space. There's some really good opportunities for investors, but investors have to be really disciplined. And when it comes to Wall Street, a lot of the guys are not disciplined. They hear video, they hear live, they think the next Twitch, they think the next YouTube, and they jump in.
Can I ask a question, Dan? Do you ever have you with your day job hat on, have you had much opportunity to vet any of the funding proposals for this level of funding? Because I've been doing streaming and startups in this space for 20 years, and I used to be hungry to go and raise funding. I always thought it was what it was all about. And these days, particularly post-cloud, the CapEx requirements have evaporated. You know, that the model these days is OpEx. And so I struggle because I haven't ever tinkered around with B2C stuff. I just assume that you raise about £1 million to bootstrap your EC2 account, and then you spend £45 million on some marketing stunt. I can't imagine what you spend that much money on a startup in this space on.
Well, I mean, yeah, I do look at a lot of these deals. On the consulting side, I spend a huge amount of time working on deals where investors come in and say, hey, can you evaluate a company we're looking to put money into? What's the competitive landscape? What's the true market opportunity? I work on a lot of deals in terms of acquisitions. So we're looking at buying 1 of 4 companies. Which ones would you recommend? So I spend a lot of time on the back end looking at financials, which is crucial, and competitive landscape, product functionality. You know, in terms of the marketing spend, it also depends on what your model is. Many are doing through channels, not direct, in which case you don't have to raise a lot of money because you don't need a lot for marketing. It also comes down to setting, again, expectations. What do you want to be? So there's some companies right now working on some new products and services that have just raised Series A, you know, $1 million, $1.5 million. The first thing I always test them with when I talk to them for the first time is I want to see if they're crazy. So the first thing I ask them is, how much revenue do you want to have in 12 months? And when they go $15, $20 million, I go, okay, you don't get it. When they say, oh, we'd like to be at $1 million, $1.5 million, perfect. Totally reasonable to think you're going to grow your business in 12 months to $1 million starting off. Absolutely. You're not going to grow to $15 million in 12 months with $1 million or $1.5 million investment. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it seems like they're stuck back in the bubble from 98 to 2000, thinking they can still get that level of run rate.
I don't think it's as bad as that. I don't think it's as bad as the bubble. I mean, you know, hell, I sold for 70 times revenue, you know, which even in today's market, you would never have again. The average cloud deal right now is getting about 7 times multiple. Forward projection for the next year, well, for this year, it'd be 2018. So it's about 7 times multiple. If you look at Elemental and Amazon, that was about 3.5 times run rate. So those deals are pretty good in terms of valuations, but the valuations that are offered somebody like Cloudflare, VCs are putting in money at another round, third or fourth round, and the valuation of a company like Cloudflare will be $2 billion, and they have $100 million in revenue. Those are way off. But look, hey, if they can get it and the investors are happy with that number, I'm not going to argue. The problem you're going to have is if our economy tanks and we have any issues and this economy doesn't keep going the way it is, you're going to have a lot of companies that are going to go under because they've set valuations on themselves and expectations that they simply can't match. And if they can't get another round, they're done.
So you mentioned 2 of the companies you mentioned, the Uyala Telstra deal and the Amazon Elemental deal. Both of those, as they were purchased, were then allowed to be run as wholly owned subsidiaries. Of course, the CEO of Telstra had to write down $249 million the next year on that particular business. Is that going to be sort of a trend going forward, that you buy these companies to be beneficial to your company, the investor's company, but then it's going to go out and do work for other companies? Or will we see this whole subsuming into an organization? I think about BAMTech, I think about some of these others. How's the model playing out as we go forward?
Well, it's not a right or wrong answer. It's playing out both ways. Look at somebody like Google takes out Avanto. Right now they're using Avanto internally for everything Google related. When Amazon first took out Elemental, they spent the first 18 months redoing everything inside for AIV, Amazon Instant Video. So they had no interest really of reselling and packaging Elemental as part of all the Amazon AWS services. They knew years down the line that they would, but they really initially bought Elemental because they had to fix all the stuff at AIV, which is a huge business for Amazon. Okay, that's now fixed. We have that where we want. The video quality is better. Ecosystem's in place. Now what else can we use Elemental for? Rolling it out on a larger platform of our cloud. So in some cases, you're going to have companies keeping this in-house, and others look at IBM. They took out Clearly. They took out Ustream. They took out that storage company. And then they end up bundling it into one platform that they can sell. So it's really a matter of how it integrates into what you already have, or if it's filling a void or a piece that you really need. But I find it interesting that in our industry, when a lot of these deals are announced, even a year later, no companies talk about integrations. They don't say, here's how we've integrated it. They don't say, here's what it took. They don't, here's what our cost was. They don't say, here's how it fits into our product portfolio. At times they do. But for the most part, you really don't hear how that technology evolved into their stack and their ecosystem, or
they don't want
to actually integrate it.
Yeah, they don't want to become a Harvard Business School case study on how things went wrong. Maybe that's why they don't announce if the integration doesn't go well.
Well, the real reason is they don't want to provide that transparency to Wall Street. They don't want Wall Street to know, here's what it actually cost to integrate the business after we acquired it, and here's how it disrupted our current operations. It's more of a numbers thing that they don't like giving out.
Dan, we saw, I don't know if you have been following what's been going on with Ericsson, but we saw, for instance, Ericsson, a number of years ago acquired Red Bee Media, and they just announced yesterday that they're selling off their media services division to focus on Red Bee Media. Does that kind of fit in with what you're talking about here in terms of the way that these larger companies acquire and then sometimes don't know what to do with what they've acquired?
Well, part of it is also just strategy. Companies acquire their companies because they have a strategy, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, our strategy changed. This is no longer a fit. Now we're going to dump it or sell it off. And some of it is just changing market conditions. And remember when Akamai bought that ad company? I forget the name. But they bought the ad company because they said, we think by buying the ad company, that's a product and service that is going to enable us to also get more of the other business that we'd like to get. So they bought that. They kept it, I think it was about 18 months. And I liked what they did. 18 months later, they sold it. And the reason they sold it is they said really clear message in the market. And they said, it's an interesting business. But what we realized was it didn't enable us to get additional core business where we really make our margins. So why continue it? Don't sell it off. Exactly. So I don't think there's anything wrong with taking chances like that. Now, when you're Akamai and you're printing cash and you're doing very well from a margin standpoint, you can afford to take chances like that. When you're a small company, it makes it much, much harder to take larger risks. But part of that too is just the changes in the market. What I never liked though is I always find it interesting how so many of these companies don't really have a clear strategy of what's going on in the market. And I'm always amazed that when I tell them what's going on, they wonder, how I get that information. And it's like, well, I'm talking to your customers. Like, don't you talk to your customers? Don't you survey them? Like, so a lot of companies operate in a bubble, which I think is natural of any industry.
I just wanted to chip in there, actually, Dan. I do some mentoring at an incubator in London every now and then, and it's amazing how many of these startups can sit and pitch for money in terms of investment and funding. But actually, when you turn around and say, okay, sell me your product, they fall apart. They just cannot sell their product. It seems to be a strange culture.
It's not our industry, though. That's always been a difference between a technology person and a business person. So there are tons of smart people in any industry you look at who are very good technically, who have PhDs, even in our industry and all the content delivery stuff and all the patents and routing algorithms and whatnot. But good technology people don't always make good business people. Just because you're great at technology doesn't mean you know how to price, package, productize, market, and sell a service. I am not an engineer at all. I have no background in it. There are people way smarter than me, and I learned that 20 years ago. So I said, all right, I'm going to focus on the business side of this industry. How do you actually turn something into a product? How do you build it? How do you sell it? How do you package it? And I feel a lot of that is still missing in the market. People will call that marketing, but that's not what marketing is today. Most people think of marketing today, and traditionally what it is, okay, I have a product or service or solution. How do I promote it? But there's a big difference between promoting a service and packaging a service and productizing a service. And a lot of vendors in our space are going out and selling a different product to every single customer because every customer says, well, I want this different, or I want you to customize this, or I want you to change that. If you have to change it for every customer, you can't scale your business. You just can't. It's too time consuming and it costs too much money. So a lot of it is around how do you price, package, productize, market, sell, deliver, track your entire ecosystem of that product.
But is it not true that sometimes, take an OVP for instance, they may want to do a package that's education because education has a certain pain point and a certain price point. They may want to do a similar package for broadcast, but add a couple extra features in. Are they segmenting because of that? I mean, that's how the traditional video world was. You had consumer product, if we're talking about say video cameras, consumer product. Then you had industrial product for the enterprise, and then you had broadcast product. And the broadcast product was 4 times more expensive than the industrial, which is 4 times more expensive than the consumer.
Well, what the vendors learned very quickly, because a lot of them made that mistake over the last 10 years, is they think they can transition from one vertical to the other. Okay, we have a service, a product, a platform to sell into broadcast. Okay, now we're going to sell into enterprise or education. No, you can't just add a few features and repackage it and call it enterprise or education. The moment you go into enterprise, what do you have to do? Well, first and foremost, you're not inserting ads. That's a huge thing. You're not monetizing video. You have to tie into SharePoint and all these custom management systems and internet portals. That's a whole different business right there. Then you have all the security requirements that are unique inside a Fortune 500 enterprise closed network. You also have the issue from an update standpoint and what you're doing with software. When you're going into enterprise, it's now turning more into a software sale, and they typically like to buy those services based on a seat license. Well, that's very opposite from broadcast. So many vendors in our industry over the last, really from the beginning, have made the mistake of just thinking, okay, I'm doing great in this vertical, now I'll just jump into another vertical, and they think they can just tweak their product on the way they go. And that's why the companies I like and respect the most in this industry are the ones that have focus. They don't try and be everything to everybody.
It's interesting you say that, because I did a white paper for Moving Image, who actually does enterprise space only. And one of the conversations that I had with them was, you look at other OVPs who jumped different market verticals, their question to me was, are they jumping market verticals because the investors expect that and they expect the growth, or are they jumping market verticals because they can't get traction in in their core market vertical?
They're jumping market verticals because the current market they're in is not as big as they think it is or thought it would be. And investors are saying, we want you to grow faster. We're not going to take 4 to 6 to 8%. We want you growing 10 or more. So they don't know what to do. So they say, all right, well, we better enter a new vertical where there's more opportunity, which gives us a larger pie.
And that goes back. Sorry, go ahead.
Then you burn through money trying to get into that product. And then you have to market to a different vertical you're not currently marketing. So now there's a huge marketing cost. Your sales cycles are much longer, 12 months or more. You have to do a lot of test deployments, something in a lab. It's a whole different business. But yeah, the pressure is typically coming from the investors.
And that goes back to the reports that you were mentioning earlier. If a report says a market is this big, then the investor, hands them the report or emails them the report and says, how come we're not in this market? And suddenly you've got death by 1,000 cuts, it seems like, if they can't figure out how to actually properly size the addressable market.
Yeah, it's just expectations. If the market's billions of dollars or hundreds of millions, well, why are you only capturing 1/10 of 1% of it? So then it's, hey, if we give you an extra $10 million, can you capture extra 3% this year? And vendors go, sure. But then they don't really have a game plan to do that. In many cases, that's not all vendors, of course. Sure. But it's just, that's always been the case in this industry. It's also the case in the pharma industry, where you look at new startups that are developing new drugs and whatnot, where they're taking a big shot at, hey, this is the size of the market if only our drug works. Obviously there you have a lot of FDA and regulatory issues we don't have in our industry. But this conversation, sort of the end part of it that we're talking about, doesn't really come down to our industry in particular. It comes down to business.
True. Very true.
Business principles from our industry can be applied to any industry in terms of what we're learning as an industry. There are certain basic business principles, and a lot of those are missing across many different verticals, including the online video market. We're missing companies that have some basic business guidelines of how to properly go to market with a product. I mean, how many companies go to the market with a product, and then the customers go, it doesn't work. But they rush it out the door because they want to get press out, or they want to get marketing out, or investors say, update your product. The pressure from investors is what drives a lot of the things in this market that just don't work well.
That would be an interesting side conversation afterwards, because I worked in both a low-tech incubator and a high-tech incubator, and I absolutely agree. It's the same problems in business principles. Let's switch gears a little bit, though. AT&T's CEO, Dom or Eric, you can pick this one up, but if I remember correctly, the CEO at AT&T did sort of an open letter on net neutrality. What was his take on that?
Well, the open letter that he published, I believe, 2 or 3 days ago, had him asserting or calling on Congress to legislate an Internet Bill of Rights, where he said that it was, and let me just pull it up right here and look at it, where what he called on Congress to do was, he said congressional action is needed to establish an Internet Bill of Rights that applies to all Internet companies and guarantees neutrality, transparency, openness, non-discrimination, and privacy protection for all Internet users. Now, Dan, we're going to this topic because I know it's one of the topics that you've been very vocal about, certainly toward the end of the year when the FCC was making its ruling. And you'll note that one of the things that the AT&T CEO said in that letter was calling on more transparency, which is something that you've mentioned earlier in this call, and you mentioned it's always been one of the things that you've been arguing this industry needs more of. What's your take on whether or not Congress should legislate something like an Internet Bill of Rights to ensure net neutrality? And I put net neutrality in quotes because it means different things to different people.
Yeah, I mean, the whole problem with this debate is a couple things. One, it's an idea. That's all it is. Net neutrality is an idea. It's not been executed. Nobody's actually said, okay, even when the Open Internet Order came out, it didn't say what the penalty was if you violated it. It just said, well, the FCC will intervene. Okay, but can they fine you $1 million a day or $1 billion a day? I mean, the whole idea of net neutrality is just an idea, and that's the problem, is it hasn't been focused down to something that very specifically says, here's what it is and here's what it isn't. Here's who it applies to and here's who it doesn't apply to. But the biggest thing about net neutrality is it's simple. It's politics. That's all it is. It's politicians wanting to use it as a way to try and get consumers to like them. It's companies that sell to B2C that want consumers to like them. But the whole transparency thing, here's the thing. Why are we debating net neutrality as an industry? The information's out there. So Netflix will go, Comcast, AT&T, these guys will all go and they will sit behind closed doors with Congress and Senate and show them details, stats, and network charts and everything else and pricing and contracts. And yet nobody in Congress or Senate requires that stuff to be made public. Every single invite Netflix got from Congress and Senate to testify in public, they refused. They weren't forced to. So if you have our government out there saying they want to create a law for us as citizens, as individuals, and yet we can't see any of the details, any of the methodology that this law is going to be created on, what is the point? What is the purpose? There isn't one. You now basically have a couple people or companies who are creating laws for everybody that don't understand how this stuff actually works. So, and obviously this is an issue we've had a long time with the government and technology, but look, you know, I always give the example. I'm just a guy who runs a blog, right? I don't work for the New York Times. I don't work for the Wall Street Journal. I've never been to college. I don't have a degree in this stuff. I'm not a network engineer. And yet Congress and Senate is asking me to testify at their hearings on what interconnects are. I mean, they literally call up and say, we don't know what interconnects are. We would like you to testify at the Comcast Time Warner cable hearing and talk about how the internet actually works. And it's like, how are you asking me to do that? How do you not know? How do you not have people on staff? How do you not have network engineers that are way smarter than me on this stuff? Like, why don't you hire somebody who used to build out these networks and educate? But again, they don't care about that stuff. They care about the politics. So I'm so tired of net neutrality at this point because it's just, it's a waste of time. It's politics, and it's people disguising their opinions 99% of the time as facts. And it's either opinion or it's a fact. But when it comes to net neutrality, people don't say.
One thing, though, that seems to be a problem, Dan, is that with the FCC making, quote unquote, the decision that it did, suddenly it's thrown back to the states. And I know California, Representative Weiner, no relation to Anthony Weiner from New York, on January 3rd put out a net neutrality bill in California. It seems like ultimately what we're going to have is 50 different definitions, or 51 if you count the federal government, of what net neutrality is.
Probably.
Are we going to be protecting the same things? What's your sense on that? Or is it going to be that net neutrality in California means something different than net neutrality in New York or Tennessee? Or,
yeah, I mean, it could be. It could be, but frankly, who cares? Seriously, who cares? Like, the problem is Americans don't like being told they can't do something. That's all it comes down to. Americans don't like being told that they can't do something. So even though they're not being throttled, even though 99.99% of people were never going over their caps with their ISPs, remember the whole ISP cap thing? Americans got up in arms because it was like, how dare I have a cap?
Apparently, I must be part of the 0.01% because I capped mine all the time.
Well, you're in the very small minority because Comcast, frankly, thank God, put out very clear numbers and put transparency in terms of who was actually impacting based on the caps they had. But the bottom line is, when Netflix complained about not having all the access it wanted to ISPs for free, basically opening up ports on their network, did Apple back Netflix? No. Did Google? No. Did Microsoft? No. Facebook? No. Not a single company backed Netflix. Why? Because they understand that if you go out and you build your own CDN, there's an inherent cost of connecting to other networks on the internet. That's the way the internet has worked from day one. Yes, there's paid peering, there's private peering, settlement-free peering, there's different types of peering, there's interconnects, absolutely. But the bottom line is, if you're going to take on building your own CDN, there are costs there. And the ISP, they have to pay some of the cost to open up more ports on the network. The CDN provider, whether it's a Netflix or a third-party company like Akamai, they have to pay to get the traffic there as well. Both companies are paying. The problem Netflix had was they came out and said, we don't want to pay anything. How come nobody in the industry or in the government or in the media said, that seems a bit unreasonable?
Well, I think they said that because of the fact they didn't want their own personal Netflix rates to rise.
Well, exactly. What they said was, well, we really like Netflix as a company, as a consumer company. We already hate our ISP, so we'll go against the ISP, even if what Netflix is saying isn't good for the industry or accurate. So you're talking about having a conversation with irrational ideas behind it, with people who are irrational around the topic, which means you won't resolve the conversation, which to me means it's a complete waste of everybody's time.
All right, people, you've heard it here first. Dan Rayburn says it's a complete waste of time, net neutrality.
I second that.
Well,
I remember having a conversation with Vince Cerf when I was doing a project many years ago about it, and I think it's very telling that even Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn disagree about net neutrality. If the two founders of the internet can't agree on it, then there's no conversation. There's never going to be a conclusion.
It's all politics. I mean, if I could make public some of the call transcripts and recordings I have with people tied to the net neutrality debate, this entire net neutrality debate would change. It'd be flipped on its head. Because privately, companies are very clear what they're doing and why they're doing it. Publicly, they're making it sound like we're saving the internet for all consumers.
Do you remember a couple of years ago, Dan, at the New York Law School, there was a conference. I think it was like the Open Video Conference or something like that for a number of years. And it was sort of instead of net neutrality, it was sort of the digital haves and have-nots. Is this a similar scenario that's playing out with net neutrality now? Some of the same players in it?
No, not really. I mean, the major players are obviously the ones who have the most at stake. It's not consumers. Consumers don't have the most at stake here. It's Netflix and other companies who basically want to have a better P&L. So look, if Netflix can get regulators to say you can now have all the free access you want into the third-party ISPs, Netflix saves what, $150 million a year, maybe more. Well, they took a shot and they lost. Okay, I get it. I'm not opposed to that. I'd be fine if they came out and said, here's what we would like government regulators to do, and here's why. Okay, cool, pitch it. The problem is you bring it to the market under the idea that the internet needs saving, that you and I as consumers are being impacted by it, and it's impacting our lives and our business to where we need Netflix on our behalf as a country to go out and regulate and decide on rules for us. That's the problem that I have.
Well, and that's what reminded me of the Open Video Conference was Kaltura was one of the companies helping with it. And it was essentially save the internet. And when I went to the conference to cover it, I realized what was being pitched as sort of the saving part. When you went and heard the presentations were very much along the lines of, we're going to benefit these particular companies, we're going to hate on these other companies.
Yeah, but that's typically how these things go. I mean, look at, I see that in the military stuff. You see that in this business. You see it in the investment community, even if you're not talking technology. It's just, it's the nature of people. They're out looking for what's the best for them and for their company, which I understand. Netflix is a public company. They have shareholders. They want to have a good P&L. So there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. That's my point. And
so
once government gets involved, forget it.
Speaking of people, there was this article or the blog post that came out this week from the gentleman who's the chairman of MPEG, who actually started it, almost 30 years ago, if I remember correctly, Leonardo Charleone. One of the things he talks about is the fact that he feels the MPEG licensing model is broken because non-practicing entities can step in and say, oh, I've got something that's applicable to this, and I'm going to license it under FRAND. You, Dan, spent quite a bit of time when we were back in the Acacia world. Do you want to weigh in on this? Because I have a couple feelings here. I mean, he says basically promote us beyond a working group. What's your take on this?
I really don't have an opinion on that. I haven't followed that too much lately, just because, frankly, it just isn't interesting to me. I'm looking still at all the HEV stuff and HEC Advanced, and we now have 3 patent pools, and there's probably going to be a 4th one because there's a 4th one forming right now. So you definitely have to look and keep up what's going on in that. But I don't know, everybody's sort of take on that I'm not really interested in, only because I'm more interested in what are companies actually doing with the technology, what are they infringing supposedly, and what's going to happen in terms of moving forward in terms of adoption. But HEVC, I mean, 4K video is so far away anyway in terms of mass. It can't be monetized, which is a bigger issue. So I look at that patent stuff and I go, it's interesting, but we have a business issue before we get to the technology. There's a business problem that hasn't been solved yet. So
is there a potential, though, that the technology fragmentation of AV1 versus HEVC? I mean, we've been through a number of years where we had a single codec that worked pretty well. Now, obviously, it seems like we're back to the whole conversation.
But I mean, remember, again, this comes down to politics and business. You know, when people talk about standards in the internet world, I go, well, that's very nice and it sounds great, but you know, that's like, you know, just not reality. You're not dealing with the reality of the market, which is there's no standard bit rate, format, codec, aspect ratio, player protocol, because you're not going to get Google, Microsoft, Apple, Sony, and all these guys to work together on a technology. Now, on something specific like a codec, you might, but that's only because they're doing that because they have so much at stake from a monetary standpoint because of what it costs them to license it. But it's not like they're all going to say we're going to default to the same player now. Now, yes, we are all moving to HTTPS, which is great from a protocol standpoint. I mean, no more RTMP, RTSP, or at least not as much anymore. But, you know, I deal in reality. I don't deal in fantasy. So for all the people that keep arguing, you know, oh, at some point there'll be a standard, you know, you can keep thinking that. But if you're not realistic of what's going on in the market, it's going to impact your business model and your product development moving forward. So I don't live in a fantasy world.
And I still think there's a bit of uncertainty. You know, Apple joined the Dash consortium, and everybody thought that meant that Apple was going to adopt Dash, and of course they never did. Apple's has now joined the Alliance for Open Media, and part of the argument is it's cheap for them to do that. They can get a chance to sort of assess what's going on there, you know, close at hand, and then decide at some point maybe to implement AV1 or maybe not. But at the end of the day, that is a business question, because that business piece impacts a whole lot of companies who use the Apple ecosystem to deliver their apps, some of which are video. Are there trends that we're going to have to look at in 2018 beyond just the codec, as you talk about larger ecosystems, that businesses need to pay attention to so that they're not getting caught in the trap of having a technology-only discussion?
Yeah, I don't think it's a trap. It's just a matter of being realistic of what's going on in the market, not living and operating your company in a bubble, talking to enough people who are actually players in the game, as I like to call it, and know what's going on a day-in, day-out basis. Understanding that there are certain companies like Apple or Sony or Google or Microsoft and Facebook who are going to dictate a lot of what happens in this industry, whether you like it or not. You can argue about it. You can say it's not right. You can say they have too much control. What's the point? They're already at that size and scale where they have control. They own ecosystems. They own hardware. They own browsers. They own operating systems. They own stores online. Like, it is what it is. Learn to work with it. So it's not like one or two things pops to mind right away when you ask me that question, but it's just a matter of companies being very realistic of what's taking place in the market and being able to sell for what's here today in short term, not thinking about, well, I need to set my company up for what's going to happen 3 years from now. Because if you do that, you lose all the focus on your business today. You won't be around in 3 years.
So Dan, give us a crystal ball gaze for us for a little bit for the last 5 minutes. I know you're either going to love doing that or you're going to say I'm not going to crystal ball gaze. But give us 3 or 4 of your big trends to watch out for over this year or maybe the next 2-3 years. What do you think the big things that are going to happen?
None.
Nothing.
There aren't. That's the thing. Everyone keeps saying, "What's the trend this year?" This year's trend is the same trend as last year. You ready? More consumers are going to consume more content more often on more devices for longer periods of time at higher quality. That's the trend we have every year.
Okay.
The issue is we don't have a catalyst. That's the issue. People want the hockey stick. People want the catalyst. People go, what's that one device that's now going to make everyone buy video? And video is going to explode. Kind of like when YouTube TV came out. Oh my God. You know, YouTube's going to sign up tens of millions of people for live streaming. Well, they had a few 100,000 at most. So again, it goes back to expectations being set. But the trend in this market is always that companies want to do more with less. They want to get more value out of what they're buying. They want to be able to measure that value and that ROI with true KPIs, something that's tangible. Every company in this market is going out and saying the word quality without defining it. They say things like, we perform better, define that. So these are the issues that the industry struggles with every single year. As more videos adopted, you actually have to, I shouldn't say adopted, it's already been adopted. As more videos consumed, you have to have a way to measure that. And if you can't measure that and you can't see the value of it, it's harder for content owners and broadcasters and distributors and publishers and syndicators to push more of it out there. So I don't make any predictions like this technology will take off or this will happen. We're going to see more consolidation, no question. But think about all the deals we saw last year. I think I tracked 23 of them. That's a good amount. I don't know if we'll have more or less this year, but every year we have just more consolidation in the market, more growth. It's very organic. There's not going to be a catalyst, and it's not going to be a hockey stick of this industry, and that's a good thing.
So Dan, that sort of brings us back around to the video analytics piece, and you mentioned that was your first investment was in a video analytics company or an analytics company. Do we run the risk, and this goes maybe way back to what you're talking about transparency on the front end with CPMs, et cetera. Do we run the risk we ran in the early days of streaming, say in the first 3 to 4 years, where people were claiming that, 10 million people were watching some particular event, when we threw analytics at it, suddenly those numbers dropped, and obviously the value of the CPMs dropped dramatically. Is that why you're looking to invest in analytics on a personal level, to just know that we can measure things accurately?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I invested in this company was it's providing a different type of analytics, more in a QoS standpoint, and also in terms of what's going on with how content and QoS is being brought into where you can actually manage it. So this isn't like a, think of a third-party thing that's looking at consumers or a ComScore. This is really talking about more of the guts, what's going on the internet. And for me, that was interesting, and it was unique, and the technology was real, and it wasn't a proof of concept. It was something that was actually running with some customers. But analytics, QoS, all that stuff is always going to be important moving forward. We have to measure this somehow, and there always has to be a way to measure it, either from a business or technical standpoint.
All right, so then a couple final notes here, Dom and Eric. And Dom, I'm going to hand off to you to kind of talk just briefly about the technology, because we've continued to improve this, whether we're calling it open source platform, free platform, et cetera. Tell us what's going on with things like the automated podcasting and like that.
Hey guys, I got to jump because we're at the top of the hour.
Awesome.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real treat. The podcast will be, I was just about to blather on about our tech, so those of you that can stick with us, tell you about it. But Dan, thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thank you guys. Have a good day.
See you soon.
Yeah, bye.
And so for those of you that are just sticking with us for the wrap up, do check the website. We've added a new podcast feed. So basically, hopefully shortly after this show, once the YouTube video is up, we'll also have transformed that magically into an MP3 and published it on iTunes, Stitcher, all of your normal podcatchers and so on. You can find the links directly on the website. And there's a little bit of an experiment which I'd like some feedback on over the next month. I've also added a system which as we add stories to our Flipboard, it rips the RSS feed and turns them into bot read audio files. Now Eric and I have been debating the listenability of a robot reading. It's a bit like having Siri chatting away to you, but there have been a few occasions where
better than the robot, I would imagine.
Well, I should imagine there's some commuters who would love to fall asleep after a couple of beers on the train home, listening to the latest news, so that they can report their productivity back to their boss in the morning. So
I just couldn't get a BBC broadcaster to do that, because we would all fall asleep over here.
Well, I think that's our sign to take over, isn't it?
Sorry, guys. Yeah, take over. Tell us where you're going to be next month.
Well, a month from now, about a month from now, I believe the date is March 4th. Or no, it's March 1st, isn't it? March 1st, we will be in Brighton with Dom Robinson at his flat. We'll all be in London for Streaming Forum on February 27th, and we'll be meeting down in Brighton to do the SM Advanced Forum live from Dom's moodlit studio.
Yeah, I was asked if it was by candlelight because it looks like Dom sitting there in front of candlelight, but maybe it's just the screen. So, all right, Eric, take us out.
You just need me to turn the lights on. There you go. No, look, this is where we're coming. All right.
Very good. Very good. All right, Eric, take us out, Sting, and we'll see you all next month.